The first warning sign was a message no one could trace, the kind of note that chills a person long before danger ever shows its face. Officer Daniel Harris had always believed he could read people. After all, 10 years in law enforcement had taught him to trust patterns, instincts, and the subtle shifts in someone's eyes when they were lying. But nothing in his career prepared him for the whirlwind romance that swept him off his feet, or the chaos that would follow. He met Emily Turner on a breezy April afternoon in Cedar Ridge, a quiet community tucked between rolling fields and sleepy cul-de-sacs. She was warm, quick to laugh, and carried an air of fragility that made Daniel feel protective from the moment he saw her. Emily had just moved from out of state, looking for a fresh start after what she described as a difficult chapter. Daniel didn't press for details. He didn't need to. Her vulnerability tugged at him, and within weeks, they were inseparable. Friends joked that the two were moving too fast, but Daniel brushed it off. Emily made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. 3 months after their first date, he proposed during a quiet dinner at home. She said yes instantly, tears streaking down her cheeks, her hands trembling as if the moment meant more than she could express. By late summer, Emily announced she was pregnant, not with one child, but twins. Daniel was stunned and overwhelmed with joy. He boasted about it at the station, proudly showing co-workers sonogram photos Emily said she'd gotten at a private clinic. She placed them tenderly on the refrigerator door, touching them with a soft smile every morning as though introducing herself to the children she carried. But in the shadows of this happiness hovered another figure, Sarah Mitchell, Daniel's ex-girlfriend. Their relationship had ended amicably a year prior, though Emily seemed uneasy whenever Sarah's name came up. Still, Daniel assumed jealousy was normal, especially with a pregnancy underway. He reassured Emily constantly, telling her he was fully committed to their future. For a while, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Daniel worked long shifts but always hurried home, eager to check on Emily. She prepared for motherhood with an intensity that both impressed and worried him, researching baby gear, decorating the nursery, and keeping every receipt for prenatal vitamins and maternity clothes. She seemed determined to build the perfect life. Then, one crisp October morning, everything shifted. Emily received an anonymous text, "You don't deserve him." A minute later, another followed, "This won't end well for you." Her hands shook as she showed Daniel. The number was blocked. No name, no clue, just those blunt, cold sentences. Daniel immediately suspected Sarah. She had never shown signs of hostility, but jealousy could twist anyone. He urged Emily to stay calm, promising to handle it discreetly. But the messages didn't stop. They escalated, vague threats, unsettling accusations, and comments about Emily's pregnancy that felt too invasive to ignore. Emily grew anxious, flinching at every sound outside their home. She insisted someone was watching the house at night. Daniel, torn between his duty as an officer and his fear for his family, filed informal notes at work and asked colleagues to keep an eye out. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling coiling in his gut. Something about the messages felt off. And soon, the first frightening incident would make him question everything he thought he knew. The first incident came on a cold evening in mid-November, when the sun dipped early behind the cedar trees and the neighborhood sank into that familiar, winter quiet. Daniel had just finished a late shift when he received a frantic call from Emily. Her voice trembled so violently that he could barely understand her at first. "Someone was at the window," she whispered. "Daniel, I swear I saw a shadow right outside the living room." He sped home, lights flashing but sirens off, heart pounding as though he were racing toward a crime scene rather than his own front door. When he arrived, Emily was curled on the couch under a blanket, her breathing shallow, eyes wide and wild. She pointed toward the window, insisting she'd seen a figure watching her. Daniel inspected the yard, flashlight sweeping across dead leaves and the garden path, nothing disturbed, no footprints, no sign of anyone. But Emily's fear was real, and her voice cracked when she begged him not to dismiss it. That night, he stayed awake long after she fell asleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying her panic in his mind. Days later, the threats evolved. Daniel came home one afternoon to find Emily standing in the driveway, clutching a printed message someone had slipped beneath their door. The note was blunt, typed, and unmistakably malicious. "You can't hide from the truth." Emily insisted it had to be Sarah. She told Daniel she'd once seen Sarah driving slowly past the house. She swore she spotted Sarah's profile in the window of a dark SUV parked down the block. Daniel wasn't convinced, it didn't match Sarah's behavior, but Emily repeated it with such certainty that doubt began to blur the edges of his reasoning. Then came the night of the ambush. Emily had gone out to pick up groceries. According to her tearful recounting, she was followed in the parking lot by a stranger who shoved her, grabbed at her arm, and hissed that, "Sarah says hi." She escaped by running into a crowded aisle and calling Daniel. He rushed to her side, checking her for injuries. Her arm was slightly red where she claimed the stranger grabbed her, but otherwise there were no marks. Still, he filed an official report this time. The situation was spiraling far beyond cryptic messages. The next morning, Daniel learned that several strangers, men he had never seen before, had shown up at their house while he was at work. They rang the bell repeatedly until Emily screamed at them through the door to leave. Once they were gone, she checked the porch and found something deeply disturbing. Printed screenshots of explicit online posts, all written under Sarah Mitchell's name. The posts invited strangers to come to Emily's address and act out a fantasy scenario involving force and humiliation. The text was graphic, disturbing, and stamped with a username nearly identical to Sarah's known social media handle. Daniel's stomach twisted as he scanned the papers. It felt coordinated, intentional. And whoever wrote the posts knew his home address. He brought everything to the station. His fellow officers were stunned, some whispered about Sarah's possible unraveling, others wondered if Emily was being stalked by someone more dangerous than an ex-girlfriend. Sarah was brought in for questioning that afternoon. To Daniel's shock, she looked genuinely confused, and terrified. She insisted she had nothing to do with the messages, the posts, or the harassment. She said someone had been using her name online for months, impersonating her, creating tension she couldn't explain. Daniel wanted to believe her, but Emily's trembling distress consumed him. Emily described Sarah's supposed hostility in excruciating detail, and to Daniel, it began to feel like a pattern too complex to ignore. Within a week, Sarah was arrested, charged with stalking, harassment, and online solicitation. Her bail was set high, and she became the center of a scandal that rippled through the community. But inside the Harris home, Emily didn't relax. The threats continued. New messages. New posts. New strangers at the door. Even while Sarah sat behind bars. And for the first time, Daniel felt a prickling chill run through him, a sense that something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't yet see the shape of it. Sarah Mitchell had been in jail for 2 full weeks when the threats reached a new level, and when Daniel's certainty began to crack. It started quietly, with a single message that arrived on Emily's phone just after midnight. "You're still lying." Emily woke Daniel, shaking him violently, insisting Sarah must be using a smuggled phone from her cell. Daniel tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't explain the timing. The message had been sent minutes earlier. Sarah, according to jail logs, was asleep in her unit under continuous supervision. Still, Emily insisted Sarah was manipulating the system somehow. She said Sarah was smart enough to make anything happen, that she was playing some long, calculated game. Daniel tried to push the thought away, but the cases he'd worked over the years had taught him that people were capable of manipulation in ways that looked impossible until proven otherwise. 3 days later, the situation escalated further. Emily called him at work, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. A package had arrived on their porch, a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a stack of printed screenshots of new online posts under Sarah's name. The messages were even more disturbing than before. They described Emily in explicit detail, outlined scenarios of assault, and invited strangers to visit the house after dark. Daniel felt physically ill reading them. But one detail lodged itself in the back of his mind, a timestamp. The newest posts had been made in the early morning hours, precisely during the same period Sarah was in solitary confinement due to a disciplinary issue at the jail. She had no device. No outside contact. Still, Emily insisted it was her. And Daniel, exhausted and feeling helpless, tried to believe her. But the seeds of doubt were beginning to sprout. The next night cemented Daniel's unease. Emily claimed someone had tried to break into the back door. She called him screaming, convinced an intruder had jiggled the lock. He sped home, lights flashing, heart pounding. He circled the house, weapon drawn, only to find no footprints, no damage, and, most alarming, the security camera had been unplugged from the inside. Emily insisted she didn't touch it. Daniel couldn't find the words to respond. By now, the stress was eating him alive. He barely slept, and every time he looked at Emily, he saw both the woman he loved and the core of a mystery he no longer understood. When jail authorities called him the next morning, the final thread of certainty snapped. Sarah had been attacked by another inmate, a woman who claimed Sarah bragged about ruining an officer's life. The inmate said she'd overheard Sarah making threats toward Emily. But when Daniel reviewed the recorded audio from the block, the alleged conversation didn't exist. The inmate had lied. Someone had coached her. Manipulated her. Someone not in jail. Later that week, during an investigative meeting, Daniel finally voiced what had been gnawing at him. What if Sarah didn't do all of this? He asked quietly. The room went silent. His colleagues exchanged uneasy looks. Emily is still getting messages, he continued. Posts are still going up. People still show up at the house. Detective Howard tapped a pen on the table, eyes narrowed. And Sarah is in custody. It was the first time someone said it aloud, the first time the implication formed into something solid. That was the moment Daniel's stomach turned to stone. Because saying it aloud made it real. If Sarah wasn't behind the harassment, then who was? When he returned home that night, Daniel found Emily in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her phone turned over, hands clasped tightly together. She looked fragile, exhausted, on the verge of collapse. Did she message again? Daniel asked gently. Emily looked up, eyes full of tears, but in them, there was something else. Something he'd never noticed before. A flicker of calculation. A spark he couldn't name. He felt the air shift. And for the first time, a chilling, impossible question surfaced. What if the danger wasn't outside their home at all, but sitting right in front of him? The turning point came on a quiet Wednesday morning, when the frost was still clinging to the grass and the world seemed eerily still. Daniel stood in the living room, staring at the nursery Emily had so lovingly decorated. 2 cribs, 2 mobiles, soft yellow walls filled with hope, a room he should have been excited about. But something gnawed at him. He opened the closet and found the box of sonogram photos Emily kept tucked away. His hands hesitated as he lifted the lid. The images were neatly arranged, but as he spread them out on the coffee table, he noticed a detail he had never thought to question: none of them had the clinic name. No date. No patient ID. Just perfect, glossy images. His pulse quickened. He grabbed his phone and discreetly sent a picture to a medical contact at the department. Within minutes, the reply arrived. These aren't originals. They look like stock images, probably downloaded. I can't be 100% sure, but they don't appear authentic. A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. Before he could process the revelation, the front door opened and Emily stepped inside, bundled in a jacket, cheeks rosy from the cold. She froze when she saw the sonogram spread out before him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating. "Why are you going through my things?" she asked softly, but her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something sharper, almost defensive. "I just wanted to look at them," Daniel answered carefully. Something felt off. Her eyes flickered, barely perceptible. "You don't believe me?" He swallowed hard. "Emily, the clinic information is missing. All of them. That's not normal." She stared at him, then smiled, a tight, brittle smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Are you calling me a liar?" Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Emily's face crumpled into a sob, and she collapsed into a chair. "Why would you question me now? After everything? After the threats and the break-ins? After what she's done to us?" Her weeping tore at him. She had always seemed so fragile. But the timing, the sudden emotional collapse the moment she was confronted, felt almost rehearsed. Later that night, as Emily showered, Daniel unlocked her laptop. He felt sick doing it, but the doubt had rooted itself too deeply. The device was encrypted, but not well enough to stop someone with his training. Within minutes, he was inside. And what he found made his breath hitch. Multiple browser profiles. All linked to different usernames. One of them matched the string used in the explicit posts made under Sarah's name. He clicked through folder after folder, finding VPN logs, screenshots of fake accounts, and even drafts of messages he remembered Emily tearfully showing him, claiming they had come from anonymous threats. Every piece of harassment. Every terrifying message. Every online post. All created from this laptop. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the evidence, bile rising in his throat. The truth slammed into him with brutal clarity. Emily had orchestrated everything. The threats. The ambush. The strangers arriving at their home. The impersonation of Sarah. All of it. A cold numbness washed over him as he sat in the dim glow of the laptop. He didn't want to believe the woman he married had fabricated a nightmare so elaborate it sent an innocent woman to jail. But the proof was undeniable. He closed the laptop slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Emily emerged from the hallway moments later, wrapped in a towel, hair dripping down her shoulders. She smiled softly, as though nothing were wrong. "You're quiet," she said. "Long day?" Daniel stared at her, really stared, and saw the truth he had been too blind, too in love, too trusting to see. Something dark lived behind her gentle facade. Something calculating. Something capable of constructing an entire world of lies. He forced a smile. "Yeah. Long day." Emily stepped closer, touching his arm with a tenderness that now felt like a performance. And as Daniel watched her, the weight of what he'd uncovered settled onto his shoulders with suffocating certainty. His wife had framed his ex, manipulated him. Fabricated a pregnancy. Created threats only she could control. Worst of all, she had fooled him. But the true horror was still ahead. Because now Daniel faced a question he never imagined he would ask. What else was Emily capable of? Daniel barely slept that night. Every breath he took felt heavier, every glance toward Emily carried the weight of the truth he hadn't yet confronted. He lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to her steady breathing. It was terrifying how peaceful she looked, as though the chaos she created never touched her. By morning, he had made a decision. He couldn't accuse her alone. He needed witnesses, investigators, and a record of every word spoken. If Emily sensed he knew, she might escalate. She already had shown she understood manipulation better than most criminals he'd ever dealt with. When he left for work, he drove straight to the station and asked to speak with Internal Affairs, something no officer ever took lightly. The moment he shut the door behind him, he felt the weight of the last several months settle into his bones. "I think my wife fabricated the threats," he said quietly. "And I think she impersonated Sarah Mitchell." The room went silent. No one moved. Then the questions came, cautious, measured, but relentless. Daniel opened Emily's laptop, handed over the files he had copied, and retold everything from the first anonymous text to the staged ambush. When he finished, the officers stared at the evidence in stunned disbelief. "We'll need a full digital forensics review," one said. "But, Daniel, this is extensive." Another added, "And Sarah is still in jail." Those words stung worst of all. The investigation shifted instantly. A search warrant was drawn up, and a team assembled to examine the Harris home without tipping off Emily. They moved in while she was out running errands, slipping quietly through the rooms she had filled with false narratives and manufactured fear. What they found was even darker than Daniel anticipated. Hard drives filled with fake profiles. Saved VPN routes masked across multiple countries. Image editing software used to create false pregnancy photos. A folder of staged evidence she had printed and shown to Daniel in moments of trembling terror. A draft of a future post suggested she had been planning yet another wave of harassment, perhaps even an escalation designed to keep the narrative alive. And then there were the medical documents. Dozens of them. All forged. She had never seen a doctor. Never taken tests. Never been pregnant at all. Daniel felt his throat constrict as he stared at the evidence laid out on the conference room table. Each piece represented a lie he had accepted. A moment he had chosen to trust her instead of trusting his instincts. Emily hadn't just deceived him. She had used his badge, his authority, as a shield for her scheme. That was the part that stung the most. 2 days later, with enough evidence to proceed safely, detectives arrived at the Harris home to arrest Emily. Daniel wasn't allowed on the scene. He understood, but it still felt like someone had reached into his chest and twisted. He waited at the station, pacing anxiously until he received word. Emily had answered the door smiling, unaware of the storm closing in. When she saw the officers' badges, her expression changed, confusion first, then a flicker of something sharper, almost like calculation settling into place. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She simply asked, "Is this because of her? Because she complained?" As if she were the victim. But when the charges were read, false reporting, impersonation, harassment, cyberstalking, her face finally cracked. Even then, Daniel knew her reaction wasn't fear. It was the realization that her carefully crafted story had collapsed. As Emily was driven away, he sat down heavily at his desk. He felt hollow, as though the last year of his life had been erased, rewritten into something he couldn't recognize. And then came the call he dreaded most. Sarah Mitchell had been released. Daniel drove to her home alone, rehearsing an apology he knew could never be enough. Sarah met him at the door, thinner, shaken, her eyes holding a mix of pain and disbelief. "You really thought I would do that?" she whispered. Daniel lowered his head. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have seen it sooner." Her voice trembled, but it wasn't angry, just tired. "I lost months of my life because someone wanted to hurt me. And you trusted her more than the truth." He didn't defend himself. He couldn't. As he walked away from her porch, the weight of guilt settled over him like a thick fog. But the fallout had only begun. Because while Emily waited in county lockup, investigators uncovered something he hadn't expected at all. Digital trails. Deleted messages. Disguised access logs. Evidence of another person involved. Someone who hadn't simply been fooled, but someone who had actively participated. The digital forensics report arrived 3 weeks later, thick enough to fill an entire binder. Daniel sat in the conference room with the lead detectives, bracing himself as page after page revealed the final twist in a case he thought he already understood. The other person involved wasn't a mysterious accomplice. It was Daniel. His own login credentials. His badge number. His access to records, time stamps, and official systems. At first, the investigators thought he might have collaborated, willingly or not, in the harassment campaign. But deeper analysis revealed the truth. Emily had used his devices while he slept, while he showered, and sometimes while he worked overtime and left his laptop at home. She had mimicked his typing style. She had memorized his passwords. She had absorbed every detail of his work life and used it to blur the line between her actions and his identity. The realization struck Daniel with brutal clarity. Emily hadn't just tried to destroy Sarah. She had built the lie so thoroughly that, if discovered early, it would have looked as though Daniel himself were responsible. And that was the final piece investigators needed. She never intended to frame only Sarah Mitchell. She was willing, and prepared, to drag her own husband into it. The trial. When the trial began 6 months later, the courtroom felt impossibly small. Emily entered in a beige jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, looking nothing like the soft-spoken woman who once baked casseroles for the neighbors and knelt beside the crib in the faux nursery. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm, almost curious detachment. The prosecution walked the jury through months of fabricated threats, staged incidents, forged documents, and coordinated impersonations. Screenshots, timestamps, and server logs formed a sequence so intricate it stunned even the most seasoned detectives. They played recordings of Daniel's interviews, his voice breaking at the realization his marriage had been built on manipulation. They showed the falsified sonogram files. The VPN paths traced across continents. The messages she wrote to herself. The posts she made under Sarah's stolen identity. Sarah Mitchell testified too. Her voice shook as she described her wrongful arrests, the weeks spent in jail, the fear that she might be attacked again, the humiliation of being branded a predator by strangers online. When asked why she believed she had been targeted, Sarah glanced toward the defense table. She hated that I existed in Daniel's past, she said quietly. She needed someone to blame for the lies she told about her life. And I was convenient. Emily never looked at her. The defense attorney tried to argue mental instability, insisting Emily had experienced a psychological breakdown rooted in trauma and fear of abandonment. But their expert's testimony wilted under cross-examination. There was no documented disorder. No history of delusions. No evidence of psychosis. Just calculation. Deliberation took less than a day. Emily Harris was found guilty of identity fraud, false reporting, cyberstalking, fabricating evidence, and multiple counts of endangering the public. She was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. As the verdict was read, Emily finally reacted, one sharp, angry laugh, as though the whole courtroom had missed the point of her performance. But the story didn't end with her conviction. Daniel's judgment. While Emily served time, the federal investigation into Daniel's involvement concluded. Although he hadn't acted willingly, his negligence, his failure to report certain incidents, his mishandling of personal devices, and his emotional entanglement affecting official decisions, resulted in additional charges. A jury convicted him of misconduct and obstruction, sentencing him to 2 years in federal custody. He accepted it without protest. Some said he was paying the price for loving too blindly. Others believed he simply couldn't bear to fight anymore. Aftermath. Sarah Mitchell's name was cleared publicly, and she filed a civil suit against the county and the Harris family. The settlement was large enough to help her rebuild her life. She moved away from Cedar Ridge, met someone new, and eventually started a family, a quiet, steady future far removed from the nightmare Emily created. Daniel, upon release, found work far from law enforcement. He lived quietly, avoiding attention, rarely speaking of the woman he once believed was the love of his life. Emily, meanwhile, completed her sentence and disappeared into obscurity. No interviews, no statements, no attempts to explain herself. As though the person she had pretended to be had simply vanished, leaving behind only the wreckage of her lies. And so, in a quiet town that once believed it understood the difference between truth and deception, the Harris case became a haunting reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous lies don't come from faceless strangers in the dark, but from the people we trust enough to let into our homes, our hearts, and our lives.